The number of people forcibly displaced around the world has risen to a record as conflicts such as those in Ukraine and Sudan continue to inflict untold suffering on communities. Now, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says the number of people displaced jumped by 19 million last year to 108.4 million. Now, this is the biggest annual jump on record since the eruption of the conflict in Sudan in May. The number is estimated to have surpassed 110 million. Now, UNHCR Chief Filippo Grandi says people have fled not only conflict, but also persecution, discrimination and violence, often mixed with other motives, in particular the impact of climate change. He projects the numbers will continue to rise. More than half of all the refugees and other people in need of international protection came from just 3 countries, with Syria topping the list, accounting for almost 1 in 5 refugees globally. Conflict-stricken countries, Ukraine and Afghanistan, also feature highly, while South Sudan has swollen this year with refugees from the Sudan war. Myanmar's 1.3 million makes it the country with the largest number of displaced people in Southeast Asia. Now, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has undoubtedly created the fastest displacement crisis and one of the largest since World War II. Some 5.7 million refugees were forced to flee Ukraine in less than a year. The UNHCR says this year's spike in displacement was increasingly being met with a more hostile environment, and international doors need to remain open. The countries hosting the most refugees are Turkey, Iran, Colombia, Germany and Pakistan.
Well, for more on these developments, we're joined by Matthew Saltmarsh from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Matthew, thanks for joining us. Now, what are some of the immediate ramifications of this staggering increase in displaced people?
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I think what this report shows again is that, of course, the number of forcibly displaced people is on the rise. We've known that for a while. The figures have been rising for 11 years in a row, but it's getting more acute. And what it shows is that, obviously, fundamentally, the international community, the international powers need to make a huge effort to try to create peace, to try to get sides that are fighting to lay down their arms. So to create the conditions in which people are able to return to their homes, because so many of them have now been displaced. But in addition to that, of course, there are huge humanitarian needs. This displacement, the movement of people, you mentioned Sudan in particular, that's obviously the most recent one, is creating huge amounts of suffering and needs. And so much more money and financial resources are needed to help those people. And then finally, I think different countries, different actors need to start to come together to try to support refugees, often where they find themselves, so that they can have a brighter future, so that they can feel included in their societies, so that they can work, so that they can get good housing, access to healthcare, and all of those things. So it's a multifaceted approach. But as you mentioned, the figures are very stark.
Now, Matthew, this report makes a distinction between those who have been internally displaced and those who have been driven to become stateless. Are those situations equally dire?
They certainly can be. I mean, if you take a situation like Sudan, the crisis there erupted in mid-April. And since then, almost 500,000 people have had to flee the country, cross borders and become refugees as to places like Chad, to Egypt, to South Sudan and some others. But equally, within the country, the situation is incredibly violent, incredibly chaotic, and incredibly dangerous. And something like 1.5 million people have been displaced within the country. And it's very difficult to get humanitarian aid, to get access to many of those places. So that's a very, very challenging situation. But Sudan, of course, is not the only one. You mentioned the situation in your region, in Myanmar, but also across the Middle East, in Syria, in Yemen, in many countries in Africa, and of course in Latin America as well. Each situation is different and has different factors that are driving it, but the needs are huge in all of those places.
Right, absolutely. Now, the UNHCR has indicated that more low and middle income nations, in fact, are hosting these displaced people more than the wealthier countries. And why do you think that is so?
Well, we often hear, certainly in Western media, that there's a queue of refugees, of displaced people who are waiting to get to richer countries, to Western countries. And of course, there are some who are seeking to do so. And we have resettlement programs that can move people from where they find themselves in displacement to wealthier countries, although the numbers there are very small. But as you mentioned, the reality of the situation is that when people flee for safety, they go to the closest safe place that they can get. That might be within the country or that might be across borders. And fundamentally, the vast majority of them actually want to go home and they want to be able to rebuild their lives at home. But of course, if they're unable to, they have to remain away from their homes. And sometimes you do get people who move onwards. Sometimes they're refugees. Sometimes they're migrants who go and move towards wealthier regions to seek a better life. But as you mentioned, the vast majority really are in middle income or low income countries.
Now, how do nations who have made bigger commitments in accepting refugees deal with a rising backlash of doing so?
Well, I think it's right to say we have seen a rising backlash. We've seen quite a few examples of xenophobia. We see hate speech. I think it's just very important to stress that, of course, there is that element. But at the same time, in many, many places around the world, we've seen a great outpouring of support for refugees. And by the way, June the 20th, just in a couple of days, is World Refugee Day. And that really is a time. Right now, we talk about the numbers and the needs and the displacement. But when we get to World Refugee Day, we talk about the inclusion and the things that refugees bring to societies. If you look back at the COVID pandemic, there were so many examples of refugees stepping up and working on the front lines in many countries, in health, in transport, in other essential services. So really, we also have to look at all those people who are making refugees welcome and to thank them for that. And hopefully, at some point in the future, the movement of refugees will decline significantly if the conditions across the world allow for that.
Right. Well, Matthew, we have a difficult question here. Of course, the upward trajectory in this, globally forced displacement is showing no signs of slowing, as you've mentioned. It keeps going up, and conflicts like Sudan, Ukraine continuing. What are the possible solutions out there? What needs to be done from countries around the world to make that happen?
Well, first and foremost, it's about creating peace. So it's about preventing wars, or in many cases, you've had conflicts and insecurity that have been going on for many, many decades. If you look at Afghanistan, we've had more than 4 decades of instability, of war, of fighting. So it's really to get the international community and the local actors to stop fighting, to come together and to work together and to live in peace and, to work in governments together. That's fundamentally the most important factor that can stop triggering new displacement. Beyond that, of course, there are financial needs. Many countries can be potentially more generous to help those people who are in displacement, to help them find solutions. And then, of course, to allow them to be better included and in some cases to integrate into their countries. And then finally, there's a lot of work that can be done on a local level with refugees, supporting them, helping them on their way with education and jobs and housing, and all of those things that allow them to become proper and contributing members of societies.
Well, let's hope more such efforts continue. Thanks for your time. Matthew Saltmarsh, the head of news and media at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.